If you will, this morning, let's turn to the book of Genesis. If you've been following the daily reading that's in the bulletin every week, you will have last week completed the story of Joseph. Some of you, I know, follow that reading. Some of you follow a different daily Bible reading. Some of you develop your own daily Bible readings. But I would encourage everybody to have some sort of systematic plan to read the Bible. Read something every day if you can. And it may be the schedule that we have printed in the bulletin, but it may be a different schedule, but we need to read our Bible and pray every day. And so that just needs to be a part of our day-to-day activity that'll help build us up. It'll bring us closer to God. It will encourage us. It might reprove us at times, but it's very beneficial. I'm not going to take the time to tell the story of Joseph, and certainly not read through the story of Joseph. Some assume that we have a good knowledge of it, a sufficient knowledge of it to talk a little bit about it this morning. If you don't know the story of Joseph, I would encourage you to go back and read it. It is told in Genesis beginning in verse 37, or chapter 37, and going all the way through chapter 50. There might be a break or two in the story along the way, but pretty consistently throughout those chapters we center on the life of Joseph. Joseph was the 12th child of Jacob, the 11th son of Jacob. Jacob had one daughter named Dinah. All the others of his children were boys, and Jacob is the next to last son. So Jacob had a total of 13 children by 4 different women. 2 of those women were his wives, and 2 of those women were servants of his wives that were given to Jacob as sort of surrogate mothers. And so they bore children by Jacob with the permission of Jacob's wives. Something unacceptable today, of course, but acceptable during that time and place. One of his wives, named Leah, had Reuben, Simeon, Levi, and Judah. Rachel, the other and favorite wife of Jacob, gave her servant to Jacob in order that she might have children on Rachel's behalf. And so her name was Bilhah, and she had Dan and Naphtali. Leah saw that, and this was just a kind of a bad situation, a rivalry between wives and jealousy and things like that. And so Leah's not conceiving during that time, and so she gives her servant to her husband Jacob in order to have children. Her name was Zilpah, and she conceives and gives birth to Gad and Asher. After they're born, Leah conceives again, and she bears Issachar, Zebulun, and Dinah. And then finally, Rachel, the favorite wife of Jacob, conceives, and she gives birth to Joseph, and then later on to Benjamin. Joseph was the favorite son of Jacob, and he showed that favoritism by giving him a special coat. We say a coat of many colors. The Hebrew word translated many colors has to do with what is flat, or the palm of the hand. And so some suggest that it may be a coat that went all the way down to the soles of the feet and the palms of the hand. And so this was not your ordinary coat, but a very special coat, one that would have been similar to the kind of clothing that nobility wore. And so Jacob, the father, is showing his favoritism to his son through this gift. Well, Joseph's brothers were jealous, and so they sold him to a caravan of Ishmaelites or Midianites who were on their way to Egypt. And when they got down into Egypt, they sold Joseph to a man named Potiphar. The rest of the story of Joseph is found in the remaining chapters of Genesis, as we said a moment ago, chapters 37 through 50. And in those chapters, we read about the ups and downs in Joseph's life, or we might say the downs and ups in Joseph's life, as it turns out. One commentator calls Joseph a righteous, wise, patient, and majestic figure in the Old Testament. And I thought that was a good description of him. Righteous, wise, patient, and majestic. His story covers just about 100 years. And so, just over that span, we read about the events that happen in Joseph's life. We can determine, if we look at things carefully, just about how old Joseph was when various events happened in his life. The Bible tells us that he was about 17 when he was sold into slavery. And so if you turn over to Genesis chapter 37 and you look at verse 2, Joseph, when 17 years of age, was pasturing the flock with his brothers while he was still a youth. And on this occasion, the brothers, well, they hear Joseph's dreams. They hear about Joseph's dreams, and they become jealous, angry with him, bitter toward him, and they sell him into slavery. And so he's about 17 years old when that happens. He's about 28 years old when he interprets the dreams of the cupbearer and butler as a prisoner in Egypt. The Bible tells us that he's 30 years old when he stands before Pharaoh. That's chapter 41 and verse 46. And so if he's 30 years old when he stands before Pharaoh, it was 2 years prior to that he interpreted the dreams of the butler and the cupbearer. It says after 2 years, the cupbearer remembered Joseph. And so he must have been about 28 years old when he interprets the dreams of those two men, his fellow prisoners. These are approximate ages. They might be a year or two off or something like that, but they're pretty close, I think. When Joseph is 37 years old, the famine occurs. Remember, he told the dream that there would be 7 years of plenty followed by 7 years of famine. And so if he's 30 years old when he makes that prediction, he must have been about 37 years old when the famine occurs. He's 39 when his brothers come to Egypt to buy food because it says they came in the second year of the famine, chapter 45 and verse 6. He's 56 or about 56 when his father dies. Jacob is 130 when he moves into Egypt. Genesis 47 and verse 9 tells us that. He lives in Egypt for 17 years. And so if Joseph is 39 when his brothers come to buy food and eventually they bring their father down and his father lives there for 17 years and dies, well then Joseph must be about 56 years old when his father dies. And then finally Joseph dies at age 110. Genesis 50 verses 24 through 25. And on that occasion, he asked his brothers to take his bones out of Egypt when they leave Egypt, to take his bones with them as they go to Canaan and bury him there. And so I think that's about right. I mean, again, give or take a few years on one side or the other, we can determine about how old Joseph was when all of these events take place. The record shows, as you can see from the title of our lesson today, that Joseph is faithful to God in every stage of his life. He's faithful to God as a young man. He's faithful to God in his middle years. We're going to talk about that a little bit. And he's faithful to God in his older years as well. Now we have people here who are in every stage of life. We have people here who are in their youth. We have people here in their middle age. We have people here who are in their older age as well. And so if you're looking for a good example, somebody that who's about your age, that you can pattern your life after, well, Joseph is really an outstanding example of that. It may be that in the beginning, Joseph is a little bit immature. Genesis chapter 37, he tells his brothers about his dreams, perhaps unnecessarily telling them about these dreams. And you remember the dreams, their brothers' sheaves of wheat bow down to his sheaf of wheat. And the sun and the moon and stars all bow down to him. And so they see the implications of that they're going to bow down to him and submit themselves to him in some way. They don't like that. That doesn't go over very well. They become very angry and jealous and bitter and resentful. And that leads to Joseph being sold into slavery. When he gets down into Egypt and he's sold to this man named Potiphar, you remember that Potiphar's wife tries to seduce him. She tries to persuade him to lie with her. And as a result of that and his refusal, he's put into prison. Now, I don't know how long it was between the time he went into Potiphar's service until she did that. Enough time would have elapsed for Joseph to gain the trust of Potiphar. You remember that Potiphar trusted Joseph so much that he gave Joseph the charge of everything in his house. Nothing was sort of outside of the jurisdiction of Joseph except for Potiphar's wife. And so that would have taken some amount of time for Potiphar to trust a Hebrew slave to that degree. And so some amount of time must have passed by. And finally, these things happen. Potiphar's wife, she lies about Joseph. He ends up in jail. He ends up in prison. And then time elapses, sufficient time for the prison guards to gain, to put their trust in Joseph as well. And so we can make the point, something like this, that between the ages of 17 and probably somewhere around 25 years old or so, he tells Potiphar's wife that he cannot sin against God. And so she tries to seduce him, as we said a moment ago, and he resists that. Not because he's afraid that Potiphar might find out, not because he might be discovered in some way, but because it would be a sin against God. And so Genesis 39 and verse 9 say that. Joseph says, there's no one greater in this house than I. He has withheld nothing from me except you, because you are his wife. How then can I do this great evil and sin against God? So Joseph's concern, in his early 20s perhaps, somewhere like that, is his behavior and conduct in the sight of God. Not in the sight of other men, although I'm sure that was a concern. But the greater concern was, how is this going to affect my relationship with God? When he's about 28 years old, he interprets the dreams of the cupbearer and the butler. But on that occasion, he doesn't take credit himself for the ability to interpret dreams, but he gives the credit to God. And so Genesis chapter 40 and verse 8 says, then they said to him, we've had a dream and there is no one to interpret it. And Joseph said to them, do not interpretations belong to God? Tell it to me, please. Interpretations belong to God. Now, God will enable me to interpret it for you, but I'm going to assure you that it's not my power that enables me to do that, or my ability, but it's God who gives the ability. At 30 years old, he told Pharaoh the same thing. When Pharaoh had some dreams and he couldn't figure out what they meant, called his wise men in. They couldn't tell him what these dreams meant. Then the cupbearer says, hey, I remember this guy was in prison here with a couple of years ago. Same thing happened to me. Had this dream, and me and the butler, we had dreams, and he interpreted those dreams for us, and they came about just like he said they would. And you need to get a hold of him. And so they called Joseph, and Joseph says to Pharaoh, it is not in me. God will give Pharaoh a favorable answer. And he says that repeatedly as he discusses these things with Pharaoh. And so in his youth, he's faithful to God. He's resists the temptations of Potiphar's wife. Now as he gets a little bit older, he's still faithful to God. He's giving God the credit that God deserves, not taking the praise for himself, but deflecting that and giving praise to God. And as a result of all that, Pharaoh himself gives credit to God for the interpretation. And so in Genesis chapter 41 and verse 39, Pharaoh said to Joseph, since God has informed you of all this, there is no one so discerning and wise as you are. And so Jacob's stand for God and representation of God has influenced Pharaoh to give credit to God. And so, again, Joseph is still a young man. He's 30 years old when this is happening. And approaching his middle years, I suppose, we would say, but yet still faithful. Between the ages of 30 and 37, Joseph continues to be faithful. Well, what happens in the story that gives us that idea? Well, in chapter 41 and verse 50, it says, before the year of famine came, 2 sons were born to Joseph, whom Asenath, the daughter of Potipharah, priest of On, bore to him. And so 2 sons were born to Joseph. And what does he call them? Now Joseph is in Egypt. He's been raised to a very high position in Egypt, given lots of responsibility, lives in the court of Egypt, no doubt, has all the trappings Egyptian royalty around him. And what does he name them? Does he give his sons Egyptian names? No, Hebrew names. He gives them Hebrew names. And so why would he do something like that? Isn't he an Egyptian? No, he still identifies himself as a Hebrew, as one of God's people, a descendant of Abraham. And so he calls his first child Manasseh, which means God has made me forget my troubles. He's still mindful of God. God has made me forget my troubles. And he names his second son Ephraim, which is related to the word for fruit. And he says that God has made me fruitful. God has made me fruitful. And so you can still see how God and his commitment to God, his thoughts about God, his faith in God, continue to determine Joseph's attitude about his behavior and about his life. Well, by the time Joseph is 39, he's able to look back at the events of his life and sees God. He can see God's plan for him. At age 39, his brothers come down to Egypt to buy food. Eventually, he reveals himself to his brothers. His brothers are afraid of him. Oh no, he's going to seek vengeance. He's going to pour out his anger against us for the way we treated him. But in chapter 49 in verse 5, Joseph says to them, God sent me before you to preserve life. And verse 7, God sent me before you to preserve for you a remnant in the earth. Now therefore it was not you who sent me here, but God. God has made me Lord of all Egypt. And so you can see, in spite of everything that's happened to Joseph, at this point he's able to look back over the events of his life and see, God's been leading me. God's been directing me. God is the one who raised me up. God is the one who brought me down here. Now, he may have done it through these human events, seemingly normal, ordinary human events, but it was God's hand that was directing all of these things, or at least leading me in and through all of these things, so that I'm in the position that I am. When he's 56 years old and his father dies, his brothers are concerned. They're worried that, now that Dad has died, Joseph may, again, become angry with us and take vengeance. But Joseph says, don't worry. Don't worry about these things. Verse 19, am I in God's place? As for you, you meant evil against me, but God meant it for good. We said a moment ago that at age 110, Joseph remembers the promise of God, that God is going to bring his children out of Egypt and bring them into a land of promise, the land of Canaan. And so he tells them, take my bones with you. When you leave, take my bones with you. Depending on and leaning on and believing in God's promise. Well, let's just make some applications here. And we've suggested some of these things already, but we'll try to elaborate on them a little bit. Joseph is a good example of a man who serves God in his youth. He serves God all through his life, but he serves God in his youth. Now, there are challenges that occur consistently through our lifetime. We might be subject to a particular temptation in our youth and middle age and in our old age as well. There are some temptations that are especially strong in youth that might not be as strong in old age. There might be some temptations that are more powerful in our old age than in our youth. Joseph is a man who's faithful to God in every stage of life. Paul tells Timothy to flee youthful lusts. Although he doesn't identify them specifically, these lusts must be especially strong in a person's youth, and others may be especially strong in our old age. As we've indicated, Joseph is faithful in his youth. So when Potiphar's wife comes and tries to persuade Joseph to lie with her, well, he refuses. He resists that temptation. Perhaps this is a temptation that is especially powerful in a person's youth. And so here's Joseph, remember his age, early 20s we would say. Here's this woman making advances toward him, and yet he resists all of those advances and refuses to lie with her. Lots of people would have chosen otherwise. A lot of people today choose otherwise. It's amazing to me that you can sit down with a person, a man or a woman, I suppose, and you can tell them, if you begin this relationship, an illicit relationship with a woman or a man, if you yield to that or if you continue with that, here is what's going to happen to you. Your wife is going to divorce you. She's going to take the children with her. So you'll be kind of a part-time dad. She's going to get half of everything that you've earned. You're going to have to sell your house, and she's going to get half of that. You're going to have to pay child support, and so your income is, a good bit of your income is going to go toward that. And so your life is going to be just one problem after another after another. You can sit down and you can tell people that, and they will say, yes, I know. And they will do it anyway. They'll have that affair anyway. So this is a very powerful temptation for people. And yet, Joseph resisted. When it comes to this temptation, and maybe other temptations as well, it seems that people abandon all reason. And yet, Joseph kept his wits about him and resisted. We can resist as well. Now, the Bible teaches us that we are to remain chaste until we're married. And so it's very clearly taught in the Bible. Hebrews chapter 13 says, let marriage be held in honor among all, in the marriage bed undefiled. But fornicators and adulterers God will judge. And we're to make a commitment to that. Now, it's not an easy commitment to make. I understand that. It's not an easy commitment for young people to make. Now, it used to be, in a generation ago or 2 generations ago, people might marry at 18 or 17 or 16 even, but now, people are waiting to be married later in life, 25, 26, 27 years. And so we're asking people to wait longer. And yet that's what the Bible requires of people. It's not an easy commitment to make. It's not an easy commitment to keep. Especially when marriage is delayed and we live in a highly sexualized culture. Any doubt about that we live in a highly sexualized culture? Joseph was committed, and Joseph resisted temptation. If Joseph can do it, we can do it as well. Joseph is faithful in his youth. Joseph, again, still in his 20s, I suppose, had already committed himself to faith in God and faithfulness to God. Now, a lot of times in people's 20s, they're beginning to form their own convictions. And so here's a person, he's grown up under the guidance of his parents. He's learned what his parents have taught him. And in a sense, his parents' faith is his faith. But in his late teens, and maybe in his early 20s, he begins to think independently. And begins to sort of wrestle with these questions of faith. Is there a God? If there is a God, what's my responsibility toward him and all of that? And so when Joseph is at that age, he's already made his commitments to God and he's faithful to those commitments. A lot of times a person's experience will have an effect on the decisions and convictions that he reaches. And so if bad things happen to a person or he sees bad things happen, well, then he might conclude, well, there must not be a God. If all these bad things are happening, God must not exist. If anybody had a right to draw that conclusion, it'd be Joseph, wouldn't it? Can't you hear his fellow prisoners, his Egyptian fellow prisoners say, hey, Joseph, they're sitting in the dungeon and he's there with his head in his... Joseph, where's your God now, Joseph? If your God's so strong, if he's all powerful, why did he let this happen to you, Joseph? And it would have been easy for Joseph to be persuaded, I'm sure. Well, maybe they're right. Maybe there is no God of Israel. Maybe he doesn't exist. But see, Joseph didn't think like that. You see, he had already made his decision. He had already made his commitment. He had already put his faith in God and decided to remain faithful to God. And so, when our young people are going to college and sitting in the university and they're taking a psychology class or a philosophy class, some kind of science class, or even an English class for that matter, And their faith is ridiculed and they're belittled and they're insulted because they're Christians. Remember Joseph. Remember Joseph. Now Joseph made a stand. He made a decision to be faithful to God in spite of the bad circumstances, the bad things that happened to him. Even when he suffers unjustly, his faith doesn't waver. Well, Joseph is faithful in his middle age. I'd say, when I say called middle age, 30 years old up to his mid-50s, he's still remaining faithful. Read about this time in Joseph's life in Genesis 42 through 50. In this period of Joseph's life, he's been raised up to this, very high position in Egypt. He enjoys the fruits of his labor. He's living, I'm sure, a very lavish, or at least has the opportunity to live a very lavish lifestyle. He can take advantage of the position that he has. And that happens to people sometimes today. In middle age, people begin to make a little money. They start getting ahead. They become prosperous, if not wealthy, very comfortable lifestyle. And they enjoy all of those things without giving very much thought to spiritual things. And so, hey, I'm coming into a little bit of money. What am I going to do? I'm going to buy a big house. I'm going to drive a high-end car. I'm going to buy some other vanities as well. I'm going to buy a lake house or a beach house. I'm going to spend my weekends there. Maybe I'll join a golf club. Maybe I'll travel. And so they enjoy all these things that their prosperity brings them, and sometimes they give very little thought to God. But Joseph doesn't do that. We've already indicated that during this time in life, he still remembers God. When his children are born, he gives them Hebrew names, names that reflect his relationship with God and God's actions in his life. And so, he doesn't let this lifestyle influence him to forget about God. He remembers God. He doesn't become bitter or angry as he grows older. His attitude about his circumstances is always positive. You meant it for evil, but God meant it for good. It was God that brought me down here. It was God that made me Lord of Egypt. Even after Jacob dies, he reassures his brothers that he's not angry with them or bitter toward them or resentful. He's able to see God's blessing in his life, even though there was plenty of disappointment. Maybe we need to work on that a little bit. The ability to see God's blessing in life, even when there's disappointment. Now, I don't mean to embarrass him, but I'm going to give you an illustration of this that happened right here. Not long ago, Steve Sewell lost his wife. I know he's brokenhearted. I know he's sad. I know he's disappointed. When I talked to him, I was gone. When all that happened, I got back. I said, Steve, I'm really sorry about Jan. And he said, the way I look at that, God blessed me for 39 years. Here's a man in the middle of disappointment, sadness. He can still see God's blessing. That's what we need to do. Can we see God's blessing even in the midst of disappointment? And so maybe we need to work on that a little bit. Joseph doesn't become bitter. He doesn't become angry. Doesn't become resentful. He's able to see God's hand at work in his life, even in times like that. And then finally, Joseph is faithful in his later years. He dies at 110 years old, and he maintains his faith in God. We noted a moment ago that Joseph knew about God's promise to bring the children of Israel out of Egypt and then bring them to the promised land. In fact, Jacob, his father, told him about that promise. And Joseph believed God's promise. He clearly had faith that God was going to deliver on the promise. And so when it came time for him to die, he made his brethren promise to take his bones out of Egypt, take them into the promised land, and bury them there. That's Genesis chapter 50, beginning in verse 22 and following. And so, Joseph doesn't become weak in faith in his old age. He doesn't become lax in his commitment. He's still strong in faith and strong in his commitment. And that's a lesson for us as well. The inheritance of God has been promised to those who hold fast the beginning of our assurance firm to the end. Hebrews chapter 3 and verse 14. And if we hold fast our confession and the boast of our hope firm to the end, well, then we have God's promise of an inheritance. But holding it fast firm to the end. To the end. It's not enough to make a good beginning. We need to see it all the way through to the end. Now understand, in our older years, the limitations of our bodies may not allow us to be as active in the service of Christ as we were in our youth. We just may not be able to. Our bodily infirmities may not allow us to do the things that we once did in our youth. But we must do what we can, even if we must lean upon our staff to do it. Remember Hebrews 11, verse 21? That's what the writer there says about Jacob. He blessed his children, leaning on his staff. Hey, when we get older, even if we have to lean on our staff to serve God, we need to do it. Well, I've told this story lots of times. Just tell it quickly. My dad was getting older. His bodily condition was worsening. By that time, he wasn't teaching, wasn't preaching. He was able to go to services. Frankly, sat on the back row and usually would fall asleep. One of the younger people approached him one day and said, "Brother Hutto, I know you think you may not be accomplishing very much right now, but you are. We're watching you." We can see. We can see the commitment. We can see the dedication. We can see the decision that you've made for the entirety of your life to serve God to the best of your ability. Now, I've told that story lots of times. I've told it from the pulpit before, but it's a powerful story. We may not be able to do what we could do in our youth as we get older, but we must do what we can, again, even if we have to lean on our staff to do it. Joseph did that. Here he is in his old age, 110 years old, still trusting in God's promise. God's going to bring us out one day. When we go out, I want you to take my bones with you. And, of course, they do. Well, there's a story of Joseph, a man who is faithful in every stage of life. In his youth, he's strong, committed, faithful. In his middle age, he doesn't forget God. He remembers God. And God still is influencing him and guiding his life and guiding his decisions. And in his later years as well. Good model for us to follow. If you're here today and not a Christian, I'll give you an opportunity to respond, to put your faith in Christ, to repent of your sins, confess that faith, and be baptized to wash your sins away. If you're already a Christian but not faithful, then do what you need to do to be right with God as you leave this place. And we may be able to help you with that. If so, we invite you to come as we stand and sing together.